The grand ballroom of the plaza doesn't know it's about to become a crime scene. To the elite sipping vintage Krug under 3-ton crystal chandeliers, this is just another Tuesday night of curated perfection. But for the man standing in the far corner, the one in the dark gray suit whose eyes haven't blinked in 3 minutes, the clock has already run out for someone in this room. He isn't here to dance. He's here to witness a reckoning. Elowen Thorne stands at the center of the gilded circle. Her royal blue gown caught the light when she entered, but now it only highlights how much she's trembling. Sterling Vane, the king of M&A and the man who spent 7 years trying to break her, doesn't care who is watching. His hand snaps out, fingers like iron talons fisted around her upper arm, pulling her so close she can smell the expensive scotch and the cheap malice on his breath. He's gritting his teeth, his index finger inches from her face, as he levels a public accusation that strips her of her dignity faster than he ever stripped her of her assets. The room freezes. Champagne flutes hover midair. The socialites do what they do best. They look away, their silence becoming a weapon Sterling uses to sharpen his grip. Elowen hunches over, her curls obscuring her face, waiting for the floor to swallow her. She thinks she is alone. But in the back of the room, Kong Dae-hyun moves. It is a slow, methodical unbuttoning. He doesn't shout. He doesn't run. He simply reaches for his lapels and begins to slide the dark gray jacket off his shoulders. Because Sterling Vane is about to learn that there's a very big difference between owning a room and surviving the man who actually controls it. The air inside the plaza was thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating perfume of old money, a sensory weight that Elowen Thorne felt the moment she stepped onto the marble floor. To the hundreds of guests arriving, the Vane Charity Gala was a pinnacle of the social season. To Elowen, it was a minefield she had been forced to navigate one last time. She adjusted the strap of her royal blue gown, the silk cool against her skin, but it offered no protection against the prickle of dread crawling up her spine. She knew he was there. She didn't need to see the salt and pepper hair or the predatory tilt of his head to know that Sterling Vane had already marked her arrival. It was a phantom sensation, a cold draft on the back of her neck that she had lived with for 7 years. Even after the divorce, even after moving across the city to build a life out of wreckage, that feeling of being hunted remained. "You look breathtaking, Elowen," a socialite chirped, her eyes scanning Elowen's face for a hint of the instability Sterling had whispered about to the boards of directors. Elowen offered practiced, porcelain smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes but kept the wolves at bay. "Thank you, Clara. It's for a good cause." The cause was supposed to be the children's wing, but as Elowen moved deeper into the ballroom, she realized the real cause tonight was her own public execution. Sterling had orchestrated her presence here, using the charity's bylaws as a leash to pull her back into his orbit. Every head that turned, every hushed conversation that died as she passed, felt like a judgment. She reached for a glass of champagne, her fingers brushing against the cold crystal. She needed an anchor. Her eyes swept the room, looking for a familiar face, a friendly port in the storm of silk and scandals. Instead, her gaze caught on something else. In the far corner of the room, near the heavy velvet drapes, stood a man who didn't fit the rhythm of the party. He wasn't talking. He wasn't drinking. He was just watching. He wore a dark gray suit that seemed to absorb the light from the chandeliers, and for a fleeting second his eyes met hers. They weren't curious or pitying. They were steady, clinical. But the moment of connection was shattered by a voice that sounded like gravel grinding over silk. "You're late, Elowen." The glass in her hand trembled. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. The air behind her grew heavy and hot with a familiar, aggressive presence. Sterling was standing just inches away, his shadow falling over her blue gown like a stain. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying intimacy. "But we both know you don't have the courage to stay away when I tell you to come." Elowen took a breath, trying to steady the architecture of her composure. She told herself she was free. She told herself the man in the corner was just a stranger. But as Sterling moved closer, his hand reaching out to claim a space that no longer belonged to him, the ballroom felt less like a palace and more like a cage. And the bars were closing in. The silence that followed Sterling's whisper was more deafening than the orchestral swell of the violins. Elowen felt the eyes of the room shifting, 100 tiny needles of social observation pinning her to the spot. Sterling didn't just want her presence. He wanted her submission as a public spectacle. He moved with a practiced, predatory grace, stepping into her personal space until the heat of his anger was palpable. He didn't see a woman or an ex-wife. He saw a rebellious asset that needed to be liquidated. "I told you in the car 6 months ago, Elowen," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that barely carried past her ear, "that you don't walk away from Vane unless I open the door. This little independence project of yours, the boutique, the new apartment, the new life, it's a fairy tale. And tonight, I'm the reality check." Elowen tried to pull back, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, but Sterling was faster. In a move that mirrored the brutal entitlement of a man who had never been told no, his hand snapped out. He didn't grab her wrist. He fisted his hand around her upper arm, his fingers digging into the soft tissue with a force that made her breath hitch. It was a grip, the same one he used in boardrooms to signal a hostile takeover, now applied to her skin. He yanked her toward him, forcing her to stumble, her royal blue gown swishing frantically. He raised his other hand, a finger pointed inches from her eyes, gritting his teeth so hard the muscles in his jaw pulsed. "You will sign the merger consent for the Thorne holdings by midnight," he hissed, the facade of the charming benefactor finally cracking. "Or I will make sure every person in this room knows exactly how unstable you were during our final months. I'll burn your name so thoroughly you won't be able to get a lease on a sidewalk, let alone a business." The ballroom didn't just go quiet. It became a vacuum. The Caucasian man with the champagne flute froze, his mouth slightly agape, a witness to a crime he lacked the spine to stop. The socialites shifted their weight, their faces a mask of disapproving shock. That was really just a thin veil for their own relief that they weren't the target. No one moved. No one spoke. The invisible architecture of the high society gala, the unspoken rule that you never interfere in a private matter, became Elowen's cage. She looked away, her long curls falling forward to hide the moisture stinging her eyes. She felt small, hunched over under the weight of his accusation and the physical pain in her arm. Sterling loomed over her, a dark silhouette of salt and pepper hair and expensive wool, drinking in her distress. He looked around the room, a triumphant sneer beginning to form. He thought he was a lion. He thought the silence was his permission. He was so focused on the terror in Elowen's eyes that he failed to notice the shift at the back of the hall. He didn't see the younger man in the dark gray suit detach himself from the shadows. He didn't hear the measured, heavy footfalls of someone who didn't care about social hierarchies. Sterling Vane was holding the room hostage, but he had no idea that he had just invited a judge into his court. Kong Daehyun lived in the silences between heartbeats. To the rest of the world, he was a ghost in a dark gray suit, a man whose presence was felt only when the air grew cold. He had stood by the marble pillar for 42 minutes, a silent sentry in a room full of noise, watching the social machinery of the elite grind the vulnerable into the dust. He had seen the way Elowen Thorne walked, shoulders braced as if expecting a blow, her royal blue gown a vibrant defiance against the gray dread in her eyes. He had seen the way Sterling Vane moved, with a heavy, unearned confidence of a man who mistook fear for respect. Daehyun did not move when the room went quiet. He did not gasp when Sterling's fingers fisted into Elowen's arm. Instead, he went into a state of clinical stillness, his mind recording every detail of the assault. The angle of Sterling's thumb, the visible tremor in Elowen's jaw, the cowed silence of the witnesses. He recognized the look on Sterling's face. It was the same expression he had seen on warlords and corporate raiders, the hunger for a total surrender that went beyond paper and ink. His jaw locked, a subtle shift that was the only outward sign of the storm brewing beneath his disciplined exterior. For Daehyun, there was no such thing as a private matter when it involved the breaking of a spirit. He knew Sterling's history. He knew the ledgers of the Vane Empire were written in the blood of people who didn't have the strength to fight back. But Elowen Thorne was different. There was a bone-deep goodness in the way she carried herself, a resilience that reminded him of something he had long ago buried in his own heart. The socialites nearby whispered about the scandal, their voices like the buzzing of flies around a fresh wound. They didn't see the man in the dark gray suit detach himself from the architecture. Dae-hyun's movements were unhurried, a rhythmic and lethal calm that sliced through the suffocating tension of the ballroom. He wasn't just walking, he was shifting the center of gravity. He reached the edge of the circle Sterling had drawn around Elowen. The king of M&A was still leaning in, his finger inches from Elowen's face, unaware that the predator had become the prey. Dae-hyun stopped 5 paces away. He didn't speak. He didn't intervene with a shout. He simply waited for the exact second of Sterling's highest triumph to begin the dismantling. He reached for the top button of his jacket, his eyes locked on the back of Sterling's neck with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The room was still watching a woman in blue fall, but Dae-hyun was already calculating the trajectory of the man who thought he had pushed her. The clock had stopped for Sterling Vane. He just hadn't heard the silence yet. The rhythmic clicking of Elowen's heels had ceased, replaced by the heavy, uneven breathing of a man who believed he was winning. Sterling Vane tightened his grip on her arm, his knuckles whitening as he prepared to deliver the final blow to her spirit. But then, a sound cut through the suffocating tension of the ballroom. Not a shout, not a crash, but the soft, deliberate rustle of fabric. Kang Dae-hyun stood just outside the circle of frozen witnesses, his movements possessing a clinical, terrifying grace. With his eyes locked on the back of Sterling's head, he reached for the lapels of his dark gray jacket. He didn't rush. He didn't look for approval from the crowd. He simply slid the garment off his shoulders. The sound of the jacket hitting the polished marble floor was quiet, yet in the vacuum of the ballroom, it resonated like a gavel. It was the sound of the old rules being discarded. Sterling stiffened, the hair on the back of his neck standing up before he even turned around. He felt the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way the oxygen seemed to vanish, leaving only the cold, pressurized aura of a man who didn't play by the rules of polite society. Slowly, Sterling's fingers loosened their iron grip on Elowen's arm. He turned, his face still twisted in a sneer that was rapidly being replaced by a flicker of primal uncertainty. Elowen stumbled back, her hand instinctively flying to the red marks blossoming on her skin. She looked up, her curls messy, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She expected to see another socialite, or perhaps a security guard. Instead, she saw Dae-hyun standing in his shirt sleeves, his tie perfectly knotted, his posture as straight and unyielding as a blade. "The lady is trembling, Mr. Vane," Dae-hyun said. His voice was low, carrying a vibration that made the champagne flutes in the hands of the observers rattle. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that carried the weight of a death sentence. Sterling tried to reclaim his dominance, his chest puffing out as he adjusted his tuxedo. "Do you have any idea who I am? This is a private matter. Get out before I have you thrown out." Dae-hyun didn't blink. He took a single step forward, crossing into the space Sterling had claimed as his kingdom. "I know exactly who you are, Sterling. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know about the Thorne merger you're trying to force with a handful of bruised skin." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor where his jacket lay, then back to Sterling's eyes. "And as for being thrown out, you should be more concerned about whether you'll be walking out of this room at all." The power in the room didn't just shift, it inverted. Sterling, the man who had just been looming like a giant, suddenly looked small, his salt and pepper hair and expensive suit stripped of their authority. The god of M&A was looking into the eyes of a man who saw him not as a legend, but as a target. Elowen stood between them, the royal blue of her dress glowing under the chandeliers. Finally realizing that the cage hadn't just been opened, it was being dismantled. The space between the two men crackled with silent, lethal electricity that seemed to dim the glow of the overhead chandeliers. Sterling Vane, a man who had built a career on smelling weakness, found himself inhaling a scent he didn't recognize, absolute, unmitigated authority. He opened his mouth to bark another order, to summon the security he paid for, but the words died in his throat as Dae-hyun took another step closer. It was a movement so precise it felt like a surgical incision into Sterling's personal territory. Dae-hyun didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The low baritone of his speech was a polite blade, sharp enough to draw blood, without leaving a visible mark. "You've spent a lot of time talking about ownership tonight, Sterling," Dae-hyun murmured, his eyes scanning Sterling's face with the clinical detachment of a man looking at a flawed specimen. You talk about the Thorne holdings as if they're a debt you're owed for the inconvenience of being a husband. But ownership is a fragile thing. It depends entirely on the silence of those who know where the bodies are buried. Sterling's sneer faltered. You're talking in riddles, boy. You think a few threats about offshore accounts scare a man like me? I am the institution. I am the name on the door. The name on the door could be painted over in an afternoon, Dae-hyun replied, his tone almost conversational. He reached out, not to strike, but to perform a gesture of terrifying intimacy. He straightened the lapel of Sterling's tuxedo with a slow, steady hand. Sterling flinched, his eyes darting to the witnesses who were now leaning in, their shock morphing into a morbid, hungry fascination. I'm not talking about accounts, Sterling. I'm talking about the 14th of March, the midnight meeting at the docks, the shipment that never reached its destination, an inspector who suddenly decided to retire to the Mediterranean. The color drained from Sterling's face so rapidly it was as if a plug had been pulled. The arrogance that fueled him for years evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man clutching a champagne flute. His hand, the one that had been bruising Elowen's arm just a moment ago, began to shake. He looked at Dae-hyun, really looked at him, and saw the stoic enforcer not as a guest, but as a predator who had been hunting him for a very long time. Elowen watched from the periphery, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She saw the god of M&A crumble without a single blow being landed. Dae-hyun leaned in, his lips inches from Sterling's ear, whispering a final, devastating detail that made Sterling's knees buckle. Sterling's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He was a man drowning in a room full of air. Dae-hyun pulled back, his expression unchanged, his eyes shifting toward Elowen with a softness that felt like a sanctuary. He had delivered the first strike, not with his fists, but with the terrifying weight of the truth, leaving the legend of Sterling Vane speechless and broken in the center of his own gilded kingdom. The heavy silence that followed Dae-hyun's whisper was a physical weight, pressing the air out of the room until the grand ballroom felt as small as a tomb. Sterling Vane remained frozen, his arms still half extended, as if trying to grasp a power that had just dissolved into ash. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, his eyes darting frantically between Dae-hyun's steady gaze and the sea of witnesses who were now recording his downfall with their silent, judgmental stares. The king of M&A was gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out fraud, shivering in the draft of his own exposed secrets. Dae-hyun didn't wait for a rebuttal. He knew there was nothing left for Sterling to say that wouldn't further condemn him. With a movement that was as fluid as it was final, Dae-hyun turned his back on the wreckage of Sterling's ego and focused entirely on Elowen. He didn't reach for her with the entitled force she had grown to fear. Instead, he simply held out his hand, palm upward, offering her a choice she hadn't been given in 7 years. It was an invitation to leave the cage behind. Elowen looked at the hand, then up at the man who had just dismantled her nightmare with a few whispered words. Her breath, which had been trapped in her chest since the first grip on her arm, finally broke free in a shaky exhale. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his, not as a victim being rescued, but as a partner in a sudden, necessary exodus. The warmth of his skin was a grounding reality against the cold terror that had defined her evening. "We're leaving," Dae-hyun said, his voice cutting to the vacuum of the room with a quiet, undeniable authority. They began to walk. The crowd parted like a dark sea, socialites stepping back into the shadows of the marble pillars, as if afraid that Dae-hyun's proximity might expose their own complicity. Elowen held her head high, the royal blue of her gown flowing behind her like a banner of victory. She didn't look back at Sterling. She didn't look at the champagne flutes or the chandeliers. She kept her eyes on the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, the exit she thought was locked by her own fear. As they crossed the threshold, the silence behind them didn't break. It deepened. The gala continued. The violins resumed their frantic play, but the soul of the event had been hollowed out. Behind them lay the ruins of a reputation and a jacket abandoned on a cold marble floor, a discarded skin of a life Elowen would never have to live again. Outside, the night air was crisp and honest, and for the first time in a decade, Elowen Thorne took a step that didn't feel like it was being watched by a predator. They left the gilded silence of the plaza behind, disappearing into the city's shadow. leaving a vacuum where a monster's pride used to be. The cold night air of the city hit Elowen's face like a splash of ice water, but the fire of adrenaline still burned hot in her veins. Beside her, Dae-hyun walked with a rhythmic, grounded silence that felt like a shield, yet as the silhouette of the plaza receded into the distance, the reality of what just happened began to settle. The safety of the shadows was an illusion. She knew Sterling Vane. She knew that a man who built his identity on the pillars of power and public perception would not simply slink away into the night. He was a creature of ego, and she had just watched his ego be vivisected in front of the very people he sought to impress. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the car Dae-hyun had summoned, Elowen stared out at the passing streetlights, her reflection in the glass looking ghostly and fragile. The red marks on her arm had begun to dull into a deep, throbbing ache, a physical reminder of the grip she had finally slipped. But the fear was no longer physical. It was systemic. She could almost hear Sterling's voice and hum of the tires, promising to dismantle her life piece by piece. He would go after her boutique. He would freeze the Thorne accounts. He would spend every penny of his vast fortune to ensure she was blacklisted from every social and professional circle in the city. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. She didn't turn to look at Dae-hyun, but she felt his attention shift toward her, heavy and protective. "You don't understand the reach of a man like Sterling. He doesn't just get angry. He gets even. He'll make sure I lose everything I've worked for since the divorce. He'll turn this into a war of attrition, and he has more resources than I have life left to live." She closed her eyes, and all she could see was the salt and pepper hair and the gritted teeth of the man who had owned her for 7 years. The gilded cage had been shattered, but the debris was still falling, and she was terrified of being buried under it. She felt like a person who had jumped from a burning building only to realize they were still plummeting. The silence of the car felt like the breath before a scream. Sterling's retaliation wouldn't be a sudden blow. It would be a slow, cold strangulation of her future. "Elowen." Dae-hyun's voice was a low vibration that seemed to pull her back from the ledge of her own panic. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her everything would be fine. He was a man of facts, and the fact was that the war had moved from the ballroom to the shadows. He is a man who thinks he is an architect, but he has been building on sand for a long time. Let him come. A man who fights to protect a lie always loses to the man who waits with the truth. Elowen gripped the silk of her royal blue gown, her knuckles white. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man in the dark gray suit was more than just a temporary reprieve. But as the city skyline loomed over them, she knew that tomorrow the sun would rise on a version of Sterling Vane that was more dangerous than he had ever been, a monster with nothing left to lose but his spite. The car glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city, the silence inside the cabin shifting from a heavy dread to a vibrating, expectant hum. Elowen watched the neon lights blur against the glass, her mind racing through every high society list, every business journal, and every whispered rumor she had ever heard. Sterling Vane was a titan who bowed to no one, yet tonight she had seen him shrink into a terrified child at the mere mention of a date and a dockside meeting. She turned her head slowly, looking at the man beside her. Dae-hyun sat with his hands folded, his profile etched in the dim light like granite. He was no longer just a stranger. He was a catalyst that had caused the most powerful man in her life to dissolve. "Who are you?" she asked, the question barely a whisper, yet it filled a small space between them. "I've spent 7 years in Sterling's world. I've met prime ministers and CEOs, but I have never seen him look at a human being the way he looked at you. He didn't just fear you. He recognized you." Dae-hyun didn't turn his head, but a ghost of a smile, cold and knowing, touched his lips. Sterling Vane builds his world on the idea that everything is for sale and everyone has a price. He thinks the law is a suggestion and the truth is a commodity. But my family, we deal in the things that cannot be bought back. We are the auditors of the things men like Sterling try to forget. He finally turned to her, and the intensity in his gaze made the air in her lungs feel thin. "My name is Kong Dae-hyun. To your ex-husband, I am the representative of the Kong Group, the silent partner that holds 40% of his debt. But to the men who operate in the dark, I am the cleaner. I am the reason that meeting on the 14th of March stayed a secret, until I decided it shouldn't be." Elowen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She realized then that Sterling wasn't just afraid of a scandal. He was afraid of an erasure. Dae-hyun wasn't just a man with a secret. He was the master of Sterling's fate. The Kong Group didn't just invest in companies. They owned the foundations upon which men like Sterling stood. If Dae-hyun pulled the plug, Sterling's entire empire wouldn't just collapse. It would be as if it never existed. "You've been watching him," Elowen realized, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. This wasn't a coincidence tonight. You weren't just a guest at that gala. "I've been watching the Vane Empire rot from the inside for 3 years, Dae-hyun admitted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous baritone. "I was waiting for the right moment to let it fall. But tonight, when he put his hands on you, when I saw the way he thought he could own your spirit as easily as he owned a subsidiary, the timeline changed. Sterling Vane thinks he is a predator, Elowen. He doesn't realize he's been living in a cage I built for him. And tonight, I decided to let the lion out." Elowen looked down at her hands, still clutching the royal blue silk. For the first time, the fear of Sterling's retaliation felt distant, replaced by a staggering realization. She wasn't just being protected by a man. She was being shielded by a force of nature that had been waiting for a reason to strike. Sterling Vane wasn't coming for her. He was running for his life. The sun rose the next morning on a city that had already begun to devour Elowen's name. Sterling Vane did not wait for the shadows to clear. He struck with the cold, calculated precision of a man who knew then the court of public opinion. The first lie told is the one that becomes the truth. By 8 a.m., the notifications on Elowen's phone were a relentless, vibrating scream. The headlines were surgical. Socialites spiral. Thorne Boutique faces liquidation amidst founder's mental health crisis. Sterling hadn't just leaked a story. He had manufactured a narrative of a woman unraveling. Anonymous sources, the very friends who had stood in the ballroom the night before, were quoted describing her erratic behavior and obsessive tendencies following the divorce. A grainy photo of her hunched over in the royal blue gown, looking frail and terrified while Sterling loomed over her, was captioned not as an assault, but as a concerned husband's desperate attempt to restrain an unstable ex-wife. Elowen sat at her small kitchen table, the light of the screen reflecting in eyes that hadn't seen sleep. She watched as her professional world began to disintegrate in real time. Her lead designer called to say the fabric suppliers were pulling their credit lines. A major investor in her boutique emailed a formal inquiry regarding her fitness to lead. Sterling was doing exactly what she had feared. He was using his vast media influence to paint a target on her back, ensuring that by the time the day was over, she would be social and financial radioactive waste. The phone rang again, but this time it wasn't journalist or a fleeing partner. It was Sterling. "Do you hear the silence, Elowen?" His voice came through the line, smooth and devoid of the rage from a night before. He sounded like a man who had regained his throne. "That's the sound of your future vanishing. I told you I would burn your name. By noon, the Thorne brand will be a joke. By tonight, you'll be a cautionary tale. But I'm a generous man. Sign the merger papers. Issue a public apology for your outburst at the gala, and I'll make the headlines go away. I'll give you a quiet life in the country where no one has to see you fail." Elowen gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white against the wood. The room felt cold, the walls closing in just as they had in the ballroom. For a moment, the weight of his machine, the PR firms, the legal teams, the bought and paid for journalists, felt insurmountable. She was a woman with a boutique. He was a titan with a megaphone. But then, her gaze drifted to the dark gray jacket she had brought home, the one Dae-hyun had left on the marble floor. It sat on her sofa, a silent reminder that Sterling was no longer the only power in the room. Sterling thought he was winning because he was loud. He didn't realize that in the world of Kong Dae-hyun, noise was just a distraction for the weak. "I'm not signing anything, Sterling," Elowen said, her voice thin but steady. "Then enjoy the ashes," he hissed, and the line went dead. The digital onslaught intensified, a second wave of leaked documents claiming financial mismanagement in her boutique hitting the wires. Sterling was throwing everything into the fire, confident that Elowen was alone in the heat. He didn't know that across town, in an office that didn't appear on any map, Dae-hyun was watching the same headlines, his fingers dancing over a keyboard with a lethal, rhythmic calm. The press thought they were writing the ending of a Elowen Thorne story. They didn't realize they were merely providing the evidence for Sterling Vane's funeral. The afternoon sun was casting long, skeletal shadows across Elowen's living room when a soft chime echoed from her laptop. She expected more bile from the tabloids, more digital stones thrown at her glass house. Instead, she found an encrypted file transfer from an untraceable source. The subject line was a single word: ammunition. Elowen clicked the folder, and for the next hour, the world outside her window ceased to exist. As she scrolled, the unstable fog Sterling had tried to wrap around her vanished, replaced by the cold, hard light of systemic corruption. Dae-hyun hadn't just sent her rumors. He had sent her the skeletal remains of the Vane Empire. There were internal memos from Sterling's private server, dated weeks before the gala, detailing a reputation liquidation strategy aimed specifically at Elowen. There were audio recordings of Sterling laughing as he instructed a PR firm to make her look like she belongs in a ward. But the real weapon lay deeper. It was a digital ledger labeled Project Icarus. It contained proof that Sterling had been embezzling from the Thorne Charity Fund for years, funneling the money into a shell company to pay off the very board directors who were currently voting for the merger. Sterling hadn't just been a cruel husband. He had been a thief, stealing from the very children the gala was supposed to protect to buy the loyalty of his peers. The front door to her apartment opened, and Dae-hyun stepped inside. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a soldier returning from a silent front. He crossed the room and stood behind her, his presence a calm anchor in the sea of her shock. He looked at the screen, his reflection ghosting over the data that would end Sterling Vane's life as he knew it. "He thinks he's playing a game of chess with you, Elowen," Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, steady baritone that vibrated to the back of her chair. "But he's actually been playing against the house, and the house always wins." Elowen looked up at him, her eyes bright with fire Sterling had tried to extinguish. "He's going to say I forged these. He'll call them the delusions of a disturbed woman. He can say what he wants to the press," Dae-hyun replied, leaning down until he was at eye level with her. He reached out, his thumb grazing the red mark on her arm that was now a fading violet. "But these files are digitally signed by his own CFO. Tomorrow morning, the board of directors has an emergency meeting to finalize the merger. You aren't going to hide, Elowen. You're going to walk into that boardroom, and you're going to hand them their own funeral notices." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black flash drive, placing it on the table like a live grenade. "Everything is on here. The accounts, the audio, the bribes. Sterling Vane spent 7 years making you feel small. Tomorrow, you show him exactly how large the world is without him." Elowen reached out and closed her hand over the drive. The weight of it felt like justice. She wasn't just a woman in a blue gown anymore. She was a woman holding the detonator to a monster's life. The fear that had been her constant companion for a decade didn't disappear. It transformed. It became the cold, sharp resolve of a person who no longer had to run. She looked at Dae-hyun, seeing the shadow protector in the light, and for the first time, she knew she wasn't just going to survive Sterling Vane. She was going to end him. The glass doors of the Vane Thorne executive boardroom swung open with a heavy, rhythmic thud that cut through the frantic murmurs of the men inside. Sterling Vane sat at the head of the mahogany table, a smirk playing on his lips as he pointed at a digital map of the Thorne holdings, projecting the image of a man in total control. But as Elowen stepped into the room, the smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. She wasn't wearing the royal blue gown of a victim. She was dressed in a sharp, ivory power suit, her curls pinned back with precision that mirrored the steel in her eyes. "Elowen," Sterling said, his voice forced into a patronizing lilt, "you're just in time. We were about to vote on the merger for your protection. I'm glad you've come to your senses." Elowen didn't take the seat at the far end of the table. She walked directly to the center, standing opposite the board of directors, men who had ignored her emails and declined her calls for weeks. She didn't look at Sterling. She looked at the board chairman, a man who had accepted a consultancy fee from Sterling just 3 days prior. "I'm not here to sign your merger, Sterling," Elowen said, her voice clear and resonant. filling the room with a frequency that made the men shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. I'm here to offer you a choice. You can resign from this board in the Thorne Charity Fund immediately, or we can discuss the contents of the Project Icarus folder. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Sterling's face went a sickly shade of gray. You're bluffing. You've been listening to the delusions of a street thug in a gray suit. Security, remove her. Security isn't coming, Sterling. A new voice boomed. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped through the door behind Elowen. Not Dae-hyun, but Arthur Kim, the city's most feared litigator, a man who only worked for the Kong Group. He laid a stack of legal injunctions on the table with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Mr. Vane, as of 5 minutes ago, the Kong Group has initiated a hostile freeze on all Vane Thorne liquid assets, pending an investigation into the embezzlement of charity funds. We are also filing a defamation suit on behalf of Ms. Thorne for the coordinated media attack launched this morning. Sterling scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. This is my house. You can't just walk in here with some hired gun and... It was never your house, Sterling, Elowen interrupted, leaning over the table, her shadow stretching across the merger documents he had worked so hard to steal. It was mine. My family's name is on the building, and my sweat is in the brand. You thought you could use my silence as a currency to buy these men. But silence is a debt that eventually comes due. She pulled the black flash drive from her pocket and slid it across the polished wood. It spun, reflecting the light of the chandeliers, and stopped directly in front of the board chairman. On that drive is the proof of the bribe Sterling paid each of you. If you vote for this merger, you aren't just partners in a business. You're co-defendants in a federal fraud case. Now shall we take that vote? The room was silent. Sterling looked around the table, his eyes wide and pleading, but the men who had been his loyal friends were now staring at the flash drive as if it were a ticking bomb. He looked at Elowen and saw a woman who was no longer hunched over or afraid. He saw the bone-deep goodness Dae-hyun had recognized, now forged into a weapon. Sterling Vane, the master of the hostile takeover, realized with a sickening jolt that he was the one being liquidated. Elowen stood alone at the center of the room, backed by the heavy artillery of the truth, watching the man who tried to break her realize he had already lost. The downfall of Sterling Vane did not happen with a bang, but with the cold, clinical precision of a light being switched on in a room full of cockroaches. By noon, the emergency boardroom session had leaked to every major financial outlet in the city, but this time, the narrative was not Sterling's command. The heavy artillery, provided by Arthur Kim and the Kong Group, hit the news cycle with the force of a tidal wave. The audio recordings of Sterling's cruel directives were played on loop across every network, his own voice convicting him in the court of public opinion. The man who had spent the morning trying to paint Elowen as unstable was now revealed to be the architect of a $1 million fraud, a thief who had used a children's charity as his personal piggy bank. Outside the Thorne Vane headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to outrage. Sterling emerged from the building not as a titan, but as a fugitive. The salt and pepper hair that had once signified wisdom and power now looked ragged and gray under the unforgiving flashbulbs of the paparazzi. He tried to maintain his god of M&A's stride, but his knees were weak, and the sight of federal agents waiting by his black sedan made him stumble. There were no concerned friends to catch him this time. The socialites who had gassed at the gala were already deleting his contact information, scrubbed clean of any association with the man who had become the city's most hated figure. Elowen watched the arrest from the balcony of her boutique, the same place Sterling had threatened to burn to ground just hours prior. She stood tall, the ivory fabric of her suit catching the midday sun. Below, she saw Sterling being read his rights, his hands fumbled into cuffs behind his back, the same hands that had fisted her hair and bruised her arm. For 7 years, he had been the sun around which her world painfully revolved. Now he was just a small, broken man being folded into the back of a police cruiser. The legend was dead. The myth of his invincibility had been dismantled by a flash drive and the courage of a woman who refused to be a footnote in his biography. As the cruiser pulled away, a heavy, cleansing silence settled over Elowen. The public disgrace of Sterling Vane was more than just a legal victory. It was a reclamation of her own name. The headlines were already changing, shifting from socialite spiral to Thorne's triumph. The institutional machines that Sterling had used to crush her were now being used to erase him. She looked down at her arm, where the faint violet marks were finally beginning to fade. The cage was gone, the predator was in chains, and as the sirens faded into the distance, Elowen Thorne realized she wasn't just standing in the light. She was the one who had finally turned it on. The silence of Elowen's penthouse was different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a woman hiding from a predator. It was the quiet of a house that had finally been cleared of its ghosts. A month had passed since the doors of the precinct had closed on Sterling Vane, and in that time, the world had rearranged itself. The Thorne name had been scrubbed with the filth Sterling tried to smear on it, and the boutique was thriving, not as a socialites project, but as a sanctuary for women who knew exactly what it felt like to be underestimated. Elowen stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city lights that glittered like spilled diamonds against a velvet night. She was wearing a simple silk robe, the royal blue gown from the gala now tucked away in a cedar chest, a relic of a war she had won. She heard the soft, familiar click of the door and didn't have to turn to know who it was. The air in the room shifted, growing steady and warm. Dae-hyun moved to stand beside her. He wasn't wearing the dark gray jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the corded muscle of his forearms and the relaxed posture of a man who was no longer on the hunt. For a long time, they simply watched the city together. Two people who had found each other in the wreckage of someone else's cruelty. The final audit came back today, Dae-hyun said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. The board has been replaced. The charity funds are being returned to the hospitals. Sterling's assets are being liquidated to cover the damages. He paused, turning his head to look at her. He's gone, Elowen, truly gone. Elowen leaned her head against his shoulder, her curls brushing the fabric of his shirt. You know, for 7 years, I thought protection meant being small. I thought it meant staying in the shadows so the monster wouldn't see me. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the city's glow. But you didn't just protect me. You gave me the floor so I could finally speak my own truth. Dae-hyun reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still surprised her. You were never small, Elowen. You were just waiting for a room that was worthy of your voice. He didn't offer her a contract or a merger. He didn't offer her a gilded cage. He simply took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, a partnership built not on power or ownership, but on the unshakable truth of who they were. What happens now? She asked softly. Now, Dae-hyun replied, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his features. We build something that isn't made of sand. He lifted her hand to his lips, a certain and unhurried press of his mouth against her knuckles. It was the same gesture from the night of the gala, but the context had transformed. It wasn't a signal to the room. It was a promise to her. Outside, the city held its ordinary noise, its crises, and its endless life. But inside, between two souls who had survived the dark, there was something permanent, impossible, and entirely theirs. Elowen Thorne took a breath, and for the first time in a decade, it tasted like peace.